So we have studied about object-oriented programming in the previous tutorials. We have also discussed some of the OOPS concept, and we know that classes are a way to introduce object-oriented programming in C++. So in this tutorial we will create classes and we will expand our knowledge of classes. And there are many features that we are going to explore in this tutorial. Like we will also discuss how data abstraction, which was an object-oriented concept, so we will also learn how we can implement that. So before starting with classes, let us just write how a class definition looks like. So to define a class, you will need to write a class keyword, and C is small, followed by the class name. So let's say the name of the class is student. And now we will use curly braces to define our class. And in these curly braces, there are member variables and member functions. So we know that member variables are simply variables and member functions are the functions that are inside this class. And we know that we can create object of this class like this: object 1, object 2, and so on. We can even create an array of objects, just like we have done in structures. We are creating arrays of structure variables. In this also we can create an array of objects by just writing object and the number of objects you want to display in it. So there are three sections of a class, and these sections are defined by type, access, specifier, and these are three keywords that are used to define three sections of the class. Number one is the private keyword, followed by a colon. So private keyword includes variable declarations. So there are variables and also functions in this section. So there are three sections of any class in C++: private, public, and similarly in public section, public is a reserved keyword, P is small, and in public also there are variables and functions also. And the last one is the protected section. And in this protected section there are variables and similarly functions also. So you can see here that this is the main difference between a class and a structure. In a structure, everything that we are doing inside the structure, every variable and function can be accessed outside the structure. And we know that we were using structure variables to access the variables inside the structure. But in case of a class, the programmer can assign which variables and functions can be assigned outside this class, or they can be accessed outside this class. So this is the main three sections of any class in C++. There is a private section. So if you declare private and colon and you are writing variables and function in it, all the variables and functions are private. By declaring variables and functions as private, these functions and variables cannot be accessed outside this class. So let's suppose this is our int main function, and in the int main function, if we try to access any variable that is in the private section, it will give an error. For example, let me take a variable here, int a, and let's suppose I am writing here object, or I'm trying to assign a value to a. Object1 dot operator is used to access the variable of the class. So if I try to assign the value of a to 7, it will give an error. So it will give an error because this is in the private section. The variable is in the private section. So someone will say, what is the use of declaring variables under this private section? This is known as data abstraction. So this example of a class is a perfect example of explaining data abstraction and encapsulation. You can see that by using objects we have encapsulated variables and functions, and by declaring variables and functions under the private section, these variables and functions are hidden and cannot be accessed outside this class. But let's suppose there is some other section, and let's suppose there is a function in a public section and it want to access this variable a. So it can access that variable. But if you are accessing this variable outside the class, it will give an error. So you can see here that this will give an error. So if you want to access a variable outside the class, you will have to declare it in the public section. So this is the main reason why we have created 3 sections of a class. So in this tutorial we will discuss only the private and the public section, and in the tutorial inheritance we will discuss protected section. Protected is similar to private, but it has some additional functionality and it can be discussed only in inheritance. So we are not going to discuss the protected section or the use of this protected access specifier. So this public and colon is known as access specifier. And if you want to access any variable or a function outside the class, outside this class, by using the object of the class, you will have to declare it in the public section. So we will also discuss all these access specifiers in the chapter inheritance again, but this is just an example of a class and 3 sections of the class. So let's just now cover functions of this class. So if you want to declare functions inside a class, you can do 2 things. So the one way is to define function inside the class. And the second way to write function is to define the whole function outside the class. So let's suppose in the public section there is a function void display, and it will just display something, but we do not want to define it inside our class. If we want to define this function outside the class, we can just use an object and then a dot operator and then the name of the function to call the function. But if you want to define this function, so let's suppose in the int main function you want to write the actual definition. So this is not the actual definition, it is just you are just declaring the function inside the class. So if you want to define it outside the class, or you can say in the int main function, what you will do is you will just use the data type void, and to call the function you will have to use the name of the class first, so that is student, and then you will use another operator known as scope resolution operator, and it looks like this. It is 4 dots or 2 colons. And this scope resolution, so this one is a new operator. This is known as the scope resolution operator. And this scope resolution operator is used to access the function and to define it. So what we will do is we will write void, then followed by the name of the class, and then a scope resolution operator, and then the name of the function, and then we will just define it. Then we can write some lines in it. So this is these are the two ways. The first one is to define the whole functions inside the class. So what you can do is, alternatively, instead of writing the whole definition here, you can do it in this place also. You can also define the whole function here only. But the reason why we are defining the function outside the class is because in the class there can be functions that are very long. So in our case this function is small, it's not so big. So if the functions are big and then you will not define it inside the class. So if the functions are doing some long operations, or if the functions are long, you will not define it inside the class. But if the functions are short, then you can define it inside the class. But mostly what we are going to do is we will just define it outside the class by using a scope resolution operator. So this is our scope resolution operator. So let's implement this example in our C-line IDE and see how this actually works. So let us create a class using the keyword class, and we will create a class student, and in this class student we will write 3 sections. It is not necessary that you will have to write all the 3 sections. You can even skip some, like you can skip the public section or the private section. But for explanation, for explaining you what this all the 3 section, I will use only 2, because the third one, the protected one, we will discuss it only in the inheritance chapter. So if you want to declare any private elements like int roll number, and let's suppose there is another variable, or let's declare some info in the public section. So we will make the subject name as public, and we will also create an array of marks. And let's now define some functions, but instead of defining here only, I will just write the function prototype here. So I will write void display here. So this function void display will just we will define it later on using the object of this class. So there are two ways to declare object of this class. Number one is you can just include it after these curly braces, or you can just create it here also in the main function. Return 0. So in the main function you can declare an object of this class. Let's say student1 comma student2. So these are the two objects of this class student, and let's suppose I want to assign a value to the roll number of student1 as 20, and I will display the roll number of student1. So let's see, will it give the error, because we know that we have declared roll number in the private section. So let's see, can we access this variable outside this class? So this is the end of this class. So can we access it outside the class? You can see here that it has also marked roll number as red underlined, and it says that roll number is private member of student. So we don't need to run this. It's obvious that it has shown us that roll number is a private member, so you cannot access it here. So let's suppose I'm going to assign subject name of the student, and I know that the subject name should be in character, but I don't want to make it complicated. Like for that I will need to create an array of characters for a subject name. So I will just write it like this, and we will just display subject name. So by using this, this gives no error, and it will simply display the subject name. This is just how you can assign values to the object. So this object S1 has its own functions and also the variables. You can assign the data to that object. So let us now define this function void outside this class. So what I will do here is I will just use void followed by the name of the class, then a scope resolution operator, and it automatically shows display. So what I will do in this function, I will just display the marks of the student. So I will use a for loop for that, and I equals 0, I less than 5 plus I, and in the next line I will display the marks of the student in the ith position. So this I'm just making it small so that the program will not be big. I will make this 5, and it will just display the marks of the student in all the 5 subjects. So this is how we will use marks I. But you can see here that marks is not declared inside the main function. It is an you can see here that this is an property of the object s1. So what we will do here, we will write s1 dot marks I. So now you can see here that it has marked it purple color because now it is matched. So this is how we will declare function. So it says function display is never used. So if you want to define the function, we know that we have to define it outside the main function. So we will just paste it outside this function and we will just display it. So this is the definition, and now we will call this function display by using s1 dot display. So the object 1 will call this display function here. It is in public and it says use of undeclared identifier display. So now this program has been, it is now correct. So we will just call the function in the main function using the object of a class, and this is how we are defining the function outside the class. So we are this is known as outside function outside the class definition. So if your program just like this, it is a small program, it's a very small function, just a 2-line function. So in that case, you do not need to write it outside the class. You can actually implement it inside the class and it will not be wrong. But if the function is a large one, it's not small. So if you will include it in the class, it will just make the class very long. So it will not be easier to detect what the functions are. So the main benefit of writing the function outside the class is that if a programmer wants to see in which function the error is, he can quickly look inside the class diff, and in this class he will just go to the function and then he can see where the definition of the function is. So it makes the code a little bit compact and it makes very easier for programmers to understand where the function is. So similarly, you can also define some more functions inside this class or even outside this, and this is how you will create object of this class and assign values to them. You can see that these objects are similar to the structure variables. The next concept that we will discuss here only is scope rules. So in the functions tutorial, we have discussed some scope rules. We have discussed some local variables and global variables also. So in this tutorial, we will discuss global classes and some local classes. So if I define a class that is here, so this class, you can create object of this class anywhere in the program. So if you're going to create a lot of functions in the program, you can access this class. But let's suppose, so this is a global class. So now this is a global class. We know that to create a global variable, we will just write it here only. So let's suppose I write int a equals 10. So we know that this is a global variable. This is a global variable. And we know that if we are creating the same variable inside a function, so if I'm writing this line here, it becomes a local variable. And the reason is because this variable is accessible only inside the main function. You cannot access this variable here or in any other function. So that's why it is local. Its scope is only limited to these blocks. So similarly, this class is a global class, and if you are writing this whole class inside the main function, so this class has become a local class. So this is now a local class, and this means that you can create objects of this class only inside this main function. So you can see that you cannot access this class outside the class definition. It says that use of undeclared identifier student, because this is now a local class. So if you want to declare a class as local, you will have to write it inside the function. But since most of the time we will declare global classes. The next concept is the nested classes. So actually we can create another class in a class, just like we were creating nested for loops. So nested for loop means a for loop inside a for loop. Similarly, nested classes means you can create another class here also. Let's suppose this is inner class, or you can even write it as nested class. Nested class. And now you can simply create the class here. It can have private section, then also the public section. P should be small, public section, and it can also have the protected section. So this way, this is a nested class. It is an inner class, and this class is private by default. So you cannot create object of this class outside this class. So if you want to make up this class public, you can just cut and paste it in the public section. So by using private, we are hiding data and we are limiting its access inside this class only. So this is known as data abstraction. And by creating objects of a class, we are just encapsulating data and functions in a single object. So S1 has its own private data, public data, and it also has a copy of these functions. So in this way, we have covered topic classes and objects. In the next tutorial, we will discuss how we can create functions that we will pass a class or object to a function, and we will also see how functions can return objects of a class. So this is just a basic tutorial of classes, and this is how you can create a class. You can try a lot of examples on the C-line IDE and just create member variables and functions in this section, and just try out in the C-line IDE and see how it is giving error if you are accessing the private data. So thanks for watching.